listening to the Halli Casser-Jayne Show. Let's talk. And I am Halli Casser-Jayne. Welcome to my listeners in the United States and around the world. Tune in to the Halli Casser-Jayne Show at hallicasserjayne.com. This week on the Halli Casser-Jayne Show, we're taking a trip to Africa with two very special women. Up first, a visit with journalist Stephanie Haines, the author of a new and highly controversial book, White Man's Game, Saving Animals, Rebuilding Eden, and Other Myths of Conservation in Africa, a thought-provoking exposé of the troubling realities of Western conservation efforts in Africa. And in our second half hour, a visit to Maasailand with Joni Bender, the author of Mile 46, Face to Face in Maasailand. You're in for two truly fascinating conversations today on the Halli Casser-Jayne Show. Let's get to it. Stephanie Haines is a regular correspondent for the Christian Science Monitor. Her work has appeared in the Washington Post and the Boston Globe, among other publications, as well as on PBSNewHour. Today, a conversation with Ms. Haines about her new, highly controversial book, White Man's Game, a thought-provoking exposé of the troubling realities of Western conservation efforts in Africa. A little background. In Africa, as well as other third-world countries, philanthropy and conservation often go hand in hand. From Bono and the Live Aid festivals, to Greg Carr, the American benefactor of Gorongosa, to Teddy Roosevelt, to Stanley and Livingstone, there's a tangled history of Western missionary explorers and do-gooders with eyes on Africa. In White Man's Game, Haines examines the larger problems that arise when Westerners try to fix complex, messy situations in the developing world, acting with best intentions, yet potentially overlooking the wishes of the people who live there. Beneath the uplifting stories we tell ourselves about helping Africans often lies a dramatic misunderstanding of what the locals actually need and want. White Man's Game is a gripping narrative of environmentalists and insurgents, poachers and tycoons, elephants and angry spirits, a narrative that profoundly challenges the way we think about philanthropy and conservation. Let's talk.
Hi, how are you?
I am just fine. How about you?
I am good, thank you.
I'm so glad you did this book. If you hadn't done it, I would have done it.
Well, thank
it's
you.
been sitting there in the back of my head for years that this book needed to be written, and here we go. Listen to me, Stephanie. First of all, it's true, because I'm on the same page as you on most of this. A little background on you first. Tell my audience who you are, how you got to Africa, the amount of time you spent there, and what led you to finally say, I'm going to write White Man's Game.
Sure. I have been a journalist for many, many years, and in the mid-2000s, I was a foreign correspondent based in southern Africa, and I started writing some conservation and wildlife stories. I hadn't done that before, but I started with a story about the endangered African wild dog, and I went into it thinking that there would be a really simple narrative, that there were good guys who were helping animals and bad guys who were either killing them or destroying their habitat. The narrative that a lot of people here have about other parts of the world and about nature. And I realized really quickly that there was so much more going on, that it was much more complicated, much more interesting, much more political, all of that. And so I started writing more and trying to understand what was going on under the surface. And White Man's Game basically stems from that. I realized that this question of what else is going on here, what are the stories we're not seeing, were the big questions of our involvement in Africa.
Provocative and eye-opening, right? But as a visitor to Africa myself, it is. And like I said, it's a high time it was written. It's a book so long overdue. But before we get into the meat of your argument, give us a little background on the white man in Africa and how we got to our perceptions of Africa from the beginning. I think you do a really good job of that in the book, which a lot of people probably wouldn't understand unless you can express it to them. So tell us a little bit about the history of the white man in Africa.
Well, there's obviously a very complicated and disturbing story of white people in Africa. But what I talk about in my book is there is a really strong storyline that we have and we put Africa sort of writ large. And a lot of it comes from stories that we started telling in the 17 and 1800s with these European explorers who would go into what they called the dark continent and come back with these fantastical stories of beauty and danger and adventure. And those themes have really stuck with us through our development aid today, through our conservation efforts today, through the way that we see this other part of the world. And one of the reasons I go into the history the way that I do in the book, well, first of all, it's fascinating and the characters are amazing. But secondly, you see these same storylines repeat themselves again and again in different iterations that feel more comfortable for whatever the modern sensibilities are at the time, but that really do touch on these same themes.
White man, though. What's the deal? So I think the point that you make, and I don't want to say it for you, I'm going to coax you to say it for yourself, but the white man, a dose of superiority, that dose of adventure, that dose of go take it from there. You know where I'm going, I think.
Yeah, well, the title of my book, White Man's Game, is a twist on the white man's burden. And that was the phrase that people use to describe this idea that in the civilized white North, it was a moral imperative that people go and help the poor Black Africans, and that we could bring better ways of living, we could bring modernization, we could bring different types of religion, we could do all of these things to help these lesser people. And again, although that rhetoric is no longer considered politically correct or appealing to those people who would be going there and helping, there is that strain through a lot of the Western aid efforts. And there is a racial dimension to it. People often in those roles who consider themselves true helpers and progressives don't like thinking about it that way, but it's sort of unavoidable. You have a lot of white people from other wealthier parts of the world coming into Africa and telling people there what to do.
I'm so glad you said it, and I think that's part of the controversy because I think that's the big whisper. That's what nobody really wants to talk about, but I think anybody who's been there for any length of time, like you or I, know what's really going on there. And it does color, maybe that's not the right word, but you know where I'm going, the way that people address the people there. My experience, by the way, Stephanie, I learned a lot more from the Africans than I think they ever learned from me. I don't know if that's
well,
been
that
your experience.
Is definitely, oh my gosh, tremendously more. And there are very few places of the world where we would accept the same idea that you can go into a place where you don't speak the language, you don't know the background, you don't know the culture, you don't know the politics. And even if you were invited by the minister of such and such to come in and run a project, there are very few places where we would think that would be possible. But for years, people have thought of Africa as, you know, the blank slate, the place where there is nothing, so whatever we have to offer and build will just be good. And, you know, as you well know, that's just completely not true. It's impossible to be true. There's incredibly rich culture and histories and belief systems that are as valid as our own, as flawed as our own, but we tend to ignore that, and people who go in there tend to ignore that.
Okay, so let's put it in this context. Let's talk philanthropy, because at the core of this conversation, that's what's there. And there's a traditional philanthropy. You talk about the likes of the Andrew Carnegie's and a more modern, what do you call it? Philanthrocapitalism, I think I remember is the term you used. Social entrepreneurship. Yeah. But take it from me here, Stephanie. Take it to Changemaker. That was brilliant how you wrote that about that.
Oh, thank you. This is something that is true when it comes to work in other parts of the world, and I think people who are involved in nonprofits will see it here in the U.S. as well. And it's basically a difference about how people are wanting to give money and why. And these days, wealthy people or even just people who want to give a few dollars here and there people aren't satisfied with donating to big institutions and charitable organizations like universities or UNICEF or big libraries. Really create their own programs to come up with their own ideas and to, get to know people on the ground. And it's this idea that for a number of wealthy people that you can take the skills that you've acquired doing your business, that you can take this idea of disrupting industries and transfer this to big systematic social problems, whether it's poverty or hunger or anything. And all of this is a really individualistic tech era American notion. And it has a lot more to do with stories that we tell here than it has to do with people elsewhere. And I think one of the pitfalls of this is that this is a bull in a china shop sort of approach to change and to people and places. And it might work if you really know intimately the place or the thing that you're trying to change. It maybe doesn't work so well if you're trying to go to some place that you don't know. That change making should perhaps come from that place.
From internal rather than external.
From internal, yeah.
Right, absolutely. Listen,
no, I'm sure you.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was going to say is you've been in Africa yourself, and you can see how people who are living there, and you talked about learning more from people than you brought to teach. I was amazed at how intimately people there understood their own problems and the absolutely ingenious solutions that people came up with. And I think tapping into some of that wisdom and respecting that initiative more would do us well.
Their way, not our way.
Yeah.
Their world, not our world. We're visitors. And I think that's so critical. You could laugh at some of the things that some of the people who come in, missionaries or whatever, get themselves involved. And by the way, I read things in your book. I had no idea some of this crazy was going on. We're going to talk about it in a minute. But it's nuts. Can I just say that? I don't know. You may not want to say that as the author, but I'm going to say it for you. Some of this stuff is just nuts. Let's talk.
Some of it's a little bit crazy.
Oh, just a little bit, right? We'll talk about one in a minute. Africa's people, it's animals, it's land, it's NGOs. Let's start with animals. We all care deeply about the preservation of wildlife in one of the world's last great frontiers, as far as I'm concerned. And some of the stories, as I said, you tell in White Man's Game. Come on, girl. Wow. The Chinese tiger story, just knocked. Just give us that one. Let's just start there, just to understand what's going on.
Sure. This was a story that I came across while I was reporting and living in South Africa. And there was a couple that started with a Chinese woman who was an executive at Gucci and then had been living in the UK with her financier American husband, and she had, as she told me, a lot of time, a lot of money. She wanted to do something, and she decided that what she really wanted to do was to try to help save the South China tiger. And she decided to do this by buying a bunch of land in Africa and trying to re-wild the tiger there. Now, to step back here, there are no tigers in Africa. There are lions, there are cheetah, but there are no tigers. And the whole idea was to import tigers into South Africa, where there was a system of wildlife experts and land management that could allow for the species to rebuild and then move them back to China, where in the meantime she would have created new nature reserves, because part of the problem there is that there aren't habitats for these tigers anymore. Dramatically endangered species. The last count I saw was that there may not be any living in the wild anymore. And so she started bringing in tigers. Now, if you step back, this is crazy, right? It's a crazy idea. It's audacious. It seems impossible. But because of that change maker narrative that we were talking about, people started going along with it. Well, these are really wealthy people. This is a crazy idea, but maybe crazy is good. Maybe disrupting this whole system is the way to succeed. And that project had a lot of ups and downs and twists and turns, and it's still going on in southern Africa. I don't think any tigers have been moved back to China. I don't know if there's any idea of doing that soon. But there in the middle of South Africa are a whole bunch of Chinese tigers.
The best laid plans go awry. This couple winds up getting divorced, and the story is just hilarious. Let's not tell it. Go read the book. But the effect on Africans and Africa and the landscape when things like this occur. Talk to me about that, because it's not just a funny story. It's not just an amusing story. It has real effects.
One of the things that I noticed working on a number of these stories was how far the ripple effects of even the most well thought out intentions can flow. Another story that I profile in the book pretty extensively is very different than the tiger story. It's grounded in a lot more scientific research, had the best minds of Harvard, of development worlds, and focused on it. And this is the restoration of this park, mid-sized park in the southeast African country of Mozambique called the Gorongosa National Park. And even there, these efforts that, again, were very well thought out, that everybody could look at and say, hey, these are good ideas. These people are going about it in the most sensitive, progressive way possible. The outcomes of these intentions have significant ripple effects and sometimes have very dark stories. And I write about some of those in the book and what happens when these different ideas of what's happening there, these different storylines clash and sometimes erupt into real violence.
Well, let's go back to Gorongosa National Park, because as you say in the book, the project went on, looked great from the outside in maybe, right? And the local community, actually, people were getting hungrier, sicker, and poorer. What's the story with that? I mean, that's what we're talking ripple effect, and why maybe the best laid plans. You got to be really careful when you go into somebody else's world, whether your intentions are moral or not.
And I would argue that we need to do a much better job of understanding where we're going and whether we should go there before we take those first boots on the ground movement. By the time that this project was going, the decision had already been made. Even no matter how many local meetings there were where people stood up and said, I really don't want you here, the decision was already made to do it, and that local input was more a tool for park administrators to try to convince people as to why what they're doing really was going to be helpful. I would argue that maybe that's not the best way to go about it. Maybe we should learn how to accept the thanks but no thanks. I believe in the book there are a number of stories about how people who start being parts of programs that seem really good, a work project for the park where somebody gets a salary for the first time, part of a mountain that becomes part of the park because now the trees won't be cut down. These things that look like triumphs from one side can be real personal tragedies and social tragedies when looked at from another side. So that person who was hired to help build a fence for an animal sanctuary ends up killing one of the animals in the animal sanctuary to bring home for his family for food, and he ends up being brought in and put on a forced work duty for many months to pay off a fine for that poaching, and his kids suffer because of it and he suffers because of it. And this is somebody whose family was tormented throughout Mozambique's history in the Civil War, and to him it's one more incident of outsiders coming in and hurting him. There are other people who have probably done very well because of the park. I mean, it's nuanced. It's not a good guy, bad guy situation. But there are a lot of lessons for us.
And I think that's important. Sometimes it does read like a cast of miscreants, a bunch of narcissistic, overfunded wackos come to Africa to save the day. But it's true. But good work is getting done, and we shouldn't say it's not, because it is. And I don't want this to be a total assault on all those who go to Africa, and I'm sure you don't either, right?
No, absolutely not. And I think that even in this park, it's again, there is good work being done. There's also harm being done. And I think the question is, so okay, how do we step back a little bit? If we all want the same thing, right? If we all want to figure out how to live in this world well, and sometimes live in it well together, how do we become good neighbors? How do we really respect each other and move forward together? And I do think there are positive ways to do that. And I think there are people in Southern Africa or Central Africa doing good work.
When you see things you see in Africa, the poverty, and poverty, a great line, by the way, you put poverty as a noun. Oh, my. You witness the sickness, the starving, worm-laden, dirty children that I've seen. And when you witness what looks like absurd to the Western way of thinking, when you see those best laid plans go awry, it's easy as a journalist to become jaded, no? How did you fight that through the years that you were there? I
think it's joy. I think one of the things that one sees in many stories, whether it's Africa or other parts of the world, is that there's an incredible amount of joy and dynamic movement and excitement, even in places that could be easily brushed as impoverished. And so for me, when I went through Southern Africa, I would always be on the lookout for that. And it was there in amazing quantities. And this isn't the like, oh, they're poor but they're happy sort of line. This is like, wow, this is an incredibly ingenious solution to this problem that this impoverished farmer has. Let's take a look at this. Or wow, here's somebody who started a movie business by showing pirated bootleg CDs to other people in this mud hut. Or here's a skyscraper that's the new home of these great startup company kids from the university in Johannesburg. Like there's so much going on there that you certainly can get jaded the same way that you can get jaded reading the newspaper every day. But being there gives you the chance to see so much more. And
I'm so glad you used the word joy, because joy is a word that I use a lot in my descriptions of Africans, because they're not jaded like the rest of the world. Yeah. And there's a certain purity that goes along with who these people are for their lack of exposure to some of the garbage that we've all been exposed to in the West. I want to talk about the Big Green very as briefly as we can, because I have a few more questions after that I want to ask, and I'm watching that clock. But I want to talk about that because you make some very good points about the Big Green, and you might want to describe who they are and why we call them that. But they work against themselves because their one hand is washing the other, deal making with other corporations that hurt them, their cause. Talk to me a little bit about that.
Sure. Big Green is the term that people will sometimes use, particularly critically use, for the big conservation organizations like the Worldwide Fund for Nature or Conservation International, the Nature Conservancy, all those ones that you've heard of before. And these are big organizations with huge budgets, with huge, wide-reaching programs, tons of assets, and a lot of times with connections to the companies that a lot of their supporters would think were the bad guys. So many of these groups have deals with chemical companies or oil companies, and the explanation is that this is a way to both get money going to the conservation organization and also to help these companies do their business in the most ecologically friendly way possible. Critics say it's something called greenwashing, which is sort of these companies are paying the conservation groups to get a green stamp of approval, and it's actually allowing them to do just the same bad old stuff but not get as much scrutiny. It's one of a number of things that have gotten people more concerned about the efficacy of these large conservation organizations.
Yeah, and I'm so glad that you made that point, and I think that's another reason people ought to pick up your book, just to read that part of it, if nothing else. Listen, as we're going to record this, I don't know if you heard this during your busy day today, but Cecil the Lion's son was killed today.
Oh, no.
Yes, and it just broke. And I want you to talk about that because you do raise some interesting points about that whole story. And we all know the story about what happened with Cecil the Lion. Talk to me about that because it's not just as black and white as people like to think.
No, it's definitely not. It's very interesting because as your listeners probably recall, this so-called beloved lion in one of the reserves in Zimbabwe was killed by an American hunter. And the media and public reaction went crazy. I mean, people were furious at this dentist who had gone over and, allegedly, quote unquote, bribed safari guides to murder this lion. And the rhetoric was intense. But what he did, there was one part of what he did that was illegal, and that was that apparently his guides had tried to lure this animal out of the reserve into one of the adjacent hunting areas. But everything else, the paying for the lion, the shooting the lion, the cutting off the lion's head as a trophy afterwards, was not only totally illegal, but was a policy that was supported by the U.S. government. We have been encouraging communities in southern Africa and elsewhere to try to put monetary value on natural resources. And the program in Zimbabwe is a particularly old one where communities will sell the rights to shoot some animals with the idea that if some of them are shot for large amounts, like $50,000 for this particular lion, then they will save the rest of the environment. The reaction, though, was totally different, and I understand that because the images were sad. And this was a lion that had been collared and tracked by a research team, a UK-based research team for many years. But some of the other details go to the point that I write about storytelling. I mean, the lion was named after Cecil Rhodes, the white founder of Rhodesia, which was the country of Zimbabwe before it was Zimbabwe. It was a lion that was probably nearing the end of its natural life. This is not to say that it should have been lured and shot at all, but there were elements of the story that made it much more complex than, mean, bad American guy going into a protected area and killing the beloved lion. That was a good storyline, but it was a little bit off.
Yeah, and I think that's important also to bring up because you mentioned the word earlier, nuance, and I do think that's important to what your book is really all about. Listen, there's something far more sinister in a lot of this from my perspective. I know being a part of a project that does it. You can build a well for $700. I don't know if you know that, but you can. We do it. My group that goes over there does it. But you get these NGO coming in, $37,000 to build the same well I can build for $700 because they get their trips funded by, government agencies or non-government agencies, and it gives them a free trip to get into Africa. Maybe that's just my take, but I do think that there is that sinister side to it all that isn't addressed enough.
There's so much money. There's so much money, so many people, so many egos, so much emotional capital invested in this. And conservation groups, the more they're adopting these other missions, these now it's not just conservation for a park, but they're doing healthcare for surrounding communities. They're doing poverty relief efforts. On the one hand, those seem really good ideas. On the other, it brings them into the same circle as the development aid world that has all of these questions.
So we get to this last thing. Is it too late for Africa? Have we taken it over and destroyed? What do you want from all of this? You took the time to write the book. Now what?
I don't think it's too late. I mean, and Africa is, right? Despite us, Africa is. And I think that what I would hope from this book is actually something very hopeful. I hope that people who want to help, who want to be engaged with the rest of the world, stop saying, how can I help this area? How can I save this animal? How can I restore this ecosystem? And take that earlier step, that more humble step, and say, how do we all live in the world together? And then go from there to start having real dialogue, real cross-cultural interactions that values other people, that listens in that full-bodied, try to change my own belief system, listening sort of way. And those are tools we can use for our interactions in Africa, but also things we can do in our own country. And I hope that that's a lesson that we can get from this book.
I've been speaking with Stephanie Haines. Her book is White Man's Game, Saving Animals, Rebuilding Eden, and Other Myths of Conservation in Africa. For more information about her book and her other work, visit Stephanie's website at stephanie-haines.com. You are listening to the Halli Casser-Jayne Show. My guests today are Stephanie Haines, the author of White Man's Game, and Joni Bender, the author of Mile 46, Face to Face in Maasailand. Tune in to the Halli Casser-Jayne Show at hallicasserjayne.com. We'll be back in a minute. Stay with us. Hi, this is Halli Casser-Jayne. Are you enjoying the show? I hope so. And I hope that you'll tell your friends about it and help us grow our family. How can you help? That's easy. I would love it if you would subscribe to the show on iTunes. And while you're there, please take the time to post a great review. I would love it even more if you would share the link to my website with your friends on Facebook and Twitter. That's HalliCasser-Jayne.com. I look forward to seeing you there. Born in Los Angeles, a fourth-generation Californian, Joni Bender grew up in the land of artists, dreamers, and sunshine. Leaving the sun-bleached sands of her youth behind, Joni transplanted to the grit and hard-edged reality of New York and Columbia University. She earned her BFA in photography from California Institute of the Arts, where she now serves as a trustee. It was while she was at Cal Arts that Joni enrolled in a study abroad program in Kenya, where she became fluent in Swahili. It is about her time in Kenya, Africa, where she traveled extensively and where she lived for several weeks with the Maasai family, that is the source of the story chronicled in her new book, Mile 46, Face to Face in Maasailand, which is a fascinating photographic and literary memoir, as fascinating as the woman you are about to meet. Now a wife and mother of two, who has served as president of the Modern Art Council at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, and has become a strong advocate of arts education in California and nationally as a Fine Arts Committee member and Education Committee co-chair for the diplomatic reception rooms of the U.S. Department of State. She is currently helping to lead an international arts-driven campaign with Futures Without Violence and the Representation Project to raise awareness about healthy masculinity and its role in eliminating domestic violence. Let's talk. So, Joni, what a terrific job. I love this book. I love the packaging of this book and the company who produced it for you. Mile 46, Face to Face in Maasailand. Beautiful photographs. But more importantly, what a powerful, empowering, and thoughtful memoir you've created here. So let's get to the beginning of all of this. I'm always interested in what gets a person to travel to Africa. And how did the calling come to a young college student, Joni? Tell us that story.
Oh, well, I grew up in Los Angeles and I had mad wanderlust because it's such a car culture, and it's so far away from anything else. And so my friends and I would always pile into our cars and take off for places. And I just had a thirst for that. And I saved money and I traveled when I graduated from high school. So by the time I got to college and I was studying some world music and had done a little bit of traveling, but mostly Europe and Mexico and sort of the easier spots, I just found that spot on the map and found a way to get there. And that was that.
And that was that. I mean, personally, I don't think anyone's quite prepared for what they meet, though, when they do get there. I remember the first time I landed in Africa and just a plane over the Entebbe airport, and seeing the water and oh my God, it's a startling place to arrive at. Do you recall those first impressions you had?
I absolutely do. I mean, I was so young, right? And I was so...
You were 21 at the time? Were you 21?
I was 21.
Yeah.
Yeah, but hopeful and optimistic. And I think I've retained some of that. I hope so.
I think so.
But certainly when I landed, I felt there was... What's that syndrome called? Do you know where they call it when people land in Jerusalem or Florence and they shake when they hit the ground and they drop to their knees and they kiss the earth because there's something so historic and powerful about the place?
I don't know this. I didn't know there was a name for it. I know I've experienced it any number of times.
I'll have to ask my archaeologist friends because they're the ones that told me about it. But yeah, that's what happened. I got there and I felt this connection to human history and something really profound. So yeah, I have a strong impression of that moment.
And it's funny about Africa too. I suspect it's about everywhere, and I've traveled a lot, as I'm sure you have. But the first thing I did was like, go, wow. And the second thing was, oh my God, what have I gotten myself into this time?
Yeah. But then you just plow through it, right? I mean,
oh, absolutely. Listen, I was a war correspondent. I don't know about you, but I mean, there's nothing that, you just go forward and that's what you do. But you were 21 years old at the time, and right. and it's a critical to your experience. So to tell us how long you were there. Let's set the story up. What were you traveling there for in the first place, and how long you wound up living with the Maasai? Because let's just get a background picture going.
Sure. So it started, like I said before, as a little bit spinning the globe and seeing where my finger landed. I knew I wanted to go go to Africa. I'd been studying African music and also along with North Indian music and other things. And I just loved the feel of that. And I loved the freedom, I think, of being 21. And I had a little fender bender in my car and had a little extra cash because I went to the cheaper place to get it fixed than I was supposed to. And I said to my parents, I want to go to Africa. I went over to UCLA and they had a room full of catalogs of school programs. I picked the one that had rolling admission, and it was this one in Kenya, and went. And so I took off from LA to Long Island, where we had this meeting with C. Everett Koop and all the kids going for all the different places around the world. And the program was a semester. So it was in total just over 5 months in Kenya. And I spent about 6 weeks with this one Maasai family, although I'd spent another time with another Maasai family before that.
Okay. So there you are, and in Kenya, and you probably, like most of us, you can never be prepared, for what you're about to see. You're intrepid, to be sure, fearless, that's clear. But here's something that you wrote in the book that this struck me, and I wrote it down. And during the night when the fire went out, there was always the threat of a lion attack, but the real danger wasn't the lions. It was the aching restlessness and isolation of the undereducated and impoverished. The club of the undereducated and impoverished. Let's talk about that.
Yeah, well, it's something that's striking, I think, in its universal quality. I mean, the truth is we have that population here in the United States. It's everywhere. But I think, actually, Darius Himes wrote my foreword. He introduced me at an event, and he said, I think you would have found this story no matter where you went. And I think that's true. It was very striking to me because I was so far out of touch from anything I knew. I was nowhere near home, nowhere near friends or mentors or parents or siblings. And I was left to my own devices. And that impression of what that meant was very, very powerful and absolutely life-changing for me.
Oh, for sure. But here's another aspect to that. Despite the abject poverty in a society that can be so cruel, as we're going to talk about in a minute, especially to women, there is this about Africa and Africans, that despite the poverty and the cruelty, they are the most welcoming people, and I have traveled the globe, with a generosity of spirit like nobody else. That's my experience. Their warmth, their inclusiveness. It can be at once disarming and at first even overwhelming, and Westerners aren't used to that kind of spirit, right, Joanie?
Yeah, I think you're right. And I find it actually probably agree. I took my family to Burma, Myanmar, over Christmas and New Year's last year, and it was my children's first experience in a culture like that. And they too, exactly as you describe it, it was disarming. They were shocked to see the poverty, the shoelessness, and the ragged nature of clothing and the frail bodies. But they remarked ultimately on the smiles, the generosity, the warmth, and the kindness, and the willingness to share. And it's so powerful. It's very powerful in Africa, for sure. That was a distinct impression and a constant, actually, not just an impression. And I like to recall that. And I like to translate that, as best I can. It's through the book, but also my actions.
Well, for sure. But I think that part of the power of your book is the fact that that theme is throughout the book, number one. Mm-hmm. And number two is this. It maybe says something about where we are in this country, because, if you go to any third world country, no matter how bad the politics are, or women's rights, any of the trouble that might be there, what you do discover there is that warmth. It's a naivete, I think, in a sense, not as exposed as Americans or Europeans are these days. And it's a part of the world that I wish we could get back. Mm-hmm. So when I'm picking up your book and reading it, mm-hmm. I felt it. It warmed my heart. I was back where I wanted to be, in a kinder, gentler place in some aspects than we know.
No, it's quite a contrast, that spectrum from that welcome that we feel as Westerners. We're just as exotic in some ways to them as perhaps they are to us, although I hate that word. But, in terms of something new and something that brings out our best behavior. But at the same time, to your point, if we were born Maasai girls and lived that life, or frankly, I could name 3 dozen cultures where the lives of women are not nearly up to human scale. Like, they're not living as complete
women,
citizens, or women. And that part is really heart-wrenching.
Right.
Yes. So one of the things I think that the book brings to light is, a lot of people are coming up to me and they're saying, oh, I loved your book. And I've been to Kenya and I've visited Maasailand and da 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 da. And I'm like, yeah, well, the one first impression, right? But just like if you stay anywhere for a longer amount of time or you live with a family, when the guards go down, things start to look a lot different.
Absolutely. No question about it. But it is interesting, I think, to note that. And let me also say that Mile 46 is also an adventure story. Who could put that down?
Oh, thank you.
I started reading that thing and I went, boom, that's it. Never went to sleep. Just kept going till I got it to the end. Tell people what Mile 46 is a reference to, though.
Yeah, sure. So where I lived was, really the middle of nowhere. It was off of every beaten path. There were no roads, no electricity, no phones, no lights, no plumbing, nothing. And there were kiosks that had popped up sort of in between these bomas, which are collections of huts where they sold, big pens and beads and cooking oil, stuff like that. And they called it Mile 46 because there was a mile marker left in the ground from when the British were, planning out the rail from Nairobi to Mombasa. It would have been, as the crow flies, 46 miles from Nairobi to Mombasa. That was the 46-mile mark. Now, the railroad did not go through this area, but it had it. That's the 46th mile.
Okay, good to know, right? If you're going to, we were talking about this terrific book. So you wind up living with this Maasai family. So let's talk about the Maasai people. I think a lot of us recognize them from old films and what have you, tall, beaded, beautiful. But who are they? Let's start with that, what they consider themselves. They think themselves as one of the lost tribes of Israel. I know that, right? And in fact, they actually practice a lot of Jewish tradition. There's a tribe like that, by the way, in Uganda. So there are a few tribes all over East Africa. But tell us more about who they are.
Yeah, sure. So they do look different from many of the other African ethnic groups, so East African tribes. They are a Nilotic people, meaning they came down the Nile, which is one of the reasons they do believe themselves to be one of the lost tribes of Israel. And as you said, they don't mix meat with milk, although their diet consists primarily of meat, milk, and blood, cow blood.
Which we're going to talk about in a minute, but go ahead.
Yeah. So this is a beautiful people. They have a language that is separate from the other languages. There's primarily the language group, language family of that region is the Bantu language group. And a lot of the different tribes have languages that derive from this Bantu root. Their language looks nothing like that. They look nothing like the rest of the people. They're very tall with aquiline noses and a reddish, beautiful, deep reddish brown skin and these startlingly white teeth, whereas the agricultural people in the region are much shorter with wider noses. Their bodies are closer to the ground. They're farmers, they're agricultural people primarily. And there's a lot of tension between the agriculturalists and the pastoralists, which is really what the Maasai are. They move with their cattle. So they have a historic tradition. They believe that the cattle are their divine providence, that God gave them the cattle as their domain. And they used to move down they started moving down the Nile and they continued to move and follow the crops and, travel about. And then eventually, as things got more organized and governments and politics, really, they were relegated to smaller and smaller plots of land. And it's really changed their culture quite a bit and it's hurt them a lot.
How about their family structure? I think that's so important to the story. Men rule. Talk to me.
Sure. Yeah. The family, they live in these things called bomas is their word for it. Kraal is the English word, although most people don't know the word kraal. It's Kraal. It's a collection of dung huts. Their huts are made from cow dung and straw. And there's a sort of a lead male who's a warrior, as all the men are. And there's sort of the dominant male. And he brings around his brothers or his wife's sister's brothers-in-law. And they live in a circular, or actually it's more like a spiral of houses. And they live among the cattle. And there's acacia, which is a thorny branches all the way around. And so there's the man and his wife, and he can have multiple wives. And that's like any polygamous culture. That is a sign of prosperity. And then this sort of inferior males and their wives. And they respond to his leadership. Everyone bends to his direction and his will. It's very powerful, very patriarchal.
And what is the role of women in their society?
Women are responsible for the children and the home and for feeding the man man and his friends. And that is about it, having children and pleasing the men. It's a very, very secondary role in that society.
And before we go further down the road of the woman's role in that, I want to talk to you about this. They, as you said, they are meat and milk and blood eaters. You once had to drink blood, yes, from a goat.
Well, it's funny because believe it or not, I was a vegetarian. So I was pretty clever. And when the blood was offered to me, they slaughtered a goat in my honor when I arrived. And they don't waste a thing. I mean, they popped out those warm kidneys and they handed them to the kids. They threw the intestines to the dogs. Like, they don't waste a bit. But the blood, yeah, they offered me blood. And I demurred, saying that really I wanted to make sure that the warriors had their strength. And I got a lot of very approving head nods. Grateful men. I just wasn't going to do it. I couldn't do it.
I think it's fascinating, right? And you were quick on your feet on that one. I don't know if I would have been that clever.
I bet you would.
Or whatever. So this is the thing that totally intrigues me. The family you live with, talk to me about the woman. I mean, what a gift to share so closely experience of women from such a different culture. Revelatory for sure, but painful too. So talk to us about the practice of arranged marriages and the domestic violence that runs rampant, but is accepted culturally. In fact, Maasai women and young girls are pretty much powerless.
They are pretty much powerless. They're really in service of the men. And the woman who was the wife, her name was Sinta May, and she was really headstrong in her way, but she was completely deferential to Kimutai, her husband. And they had an unusual arrangement because he worked in Nairobi during the week and he'd come home on the weekends. So she really ruled the roost during the week, but then she was always put back in her place when he came back. And so she lorded over me and the other women in a way because she was married to the head honcho. And the other men in the boma, they would leave every morning to graze the cattle and they wouldn't be back until nightfall. So she was such a contradiction, and she was deceitful and she was jealous and she was strong, but she snapped like a twig when the men came back. It was very interesting to watch that.
Well, the way that the society is set up, all women are the enemy, right?
Yeah, oh yeah. Well, sure, with polygamy, I think unless you're just extremely easygoing, any woman, any single woman certainly is a threat. And they aren't kind to widows either. I mean, it's just tough. It's just tough. And girls aren't raised in a way that we would consider loving. I mean, they're extra hands at best, burdens at worst.
So within that culture, there is this other thing. It's called female circumcision. For those who might not know, I can't imagine, but you just never know. Tell us about the ritual itself and its purpose.
So what the Maasai believe is that all children are born sort of philosophically sexless, that they're sort of all just kids. I mean, yes, they're female and male, but they're all just kids until they become men and women. And the way that a young boy becomes a man is he is circumcised. And it's just as if you hear, except you're doing it at 12, 13, 14 years old. And it's done without anesthetic and it's done very publicly. So the boys have it one way. The girls have it a different way. I don't know if I can say this word, their clitoris is
You can
removed.
say that word.
That word.
That's fine.
And it's done usually by a grandmother or an older woman in the community. It's a horrible, I mean, just as horrible as you could imagine, again, without anesthetic. And the best thing you can say about it is it's done in private. There are women around the hut where it's being done, but it's done in a smoky, dark, dirty place. And you can imagine there's profuse bleeding. And the young girl has to, wear black just as the young boys do until they heal. So everybody knows what's happened. And many girls don't survive. It's not a great practice. And yet the girls and boys look forward to that day because it's when they become fully female or fully male. It's incredible.
Do they understand the sacrifice that is to to their pleasure to living life to its fullest? Or is that sacrifice part of it?
Yeah, I think they do know, but I think that they think that that's a frivolity maybe. The boys don't, as you know, I mean,
right.
If anyone understands, boys don't sacrifice that much. The girls do, but I think in their minds, it wouldn't be worth, at least at that time, it wouldn't be worth the trade-off, to not be a woman and to not be marriageable.
Before I bring Esther Soler in, one of the experts on violence against women and children and the founder and president of Futures Without Violence, and we discuss in more depth female circumcision and violence against women worldwide. I want to ask you this, Joanie, a point well made in your book, in which I would like you to elaborate now, okay? We have to be careful about not only how we view the ways of other cultures, but also how we respond. I think that was a really good point you've made in the book. We have to be careful of a tendency to judge rather than to understand. I'd like you to elaborate on that as we further this discussion.
Yeah, because on the one hand, I'm an advocate, very much so, for the rights of women and girls. I'm just wild for education. I believe that is the first and foremost obligation we have, is to educate all children, but particularly make sure that the girls who are underserved get that education. But on the other hand, there's a part of me that is just relying 100% on empathy. Like, this is just founded from my experience, that it's not always right to march in to a culture or to a place with your beliefs in tow and proclaim that what someone is doing or what a culture or community is doing is wrong, because it's just, you don't have all the facts and you can't make that point fairly, and you certainly won't be heard, So I feel like there's a whole host of reasons for sensitivity first, but also just practical reasons where if you want to affect change, or if you believe that change is imperative, the way to affect it is to first be a listener before you start your talking and before you start your action. Because there aren't always ways to reconcile every point, but there certainly are better ways to achieve reconciliation through communication, sharing, and respect. We're not going to get there if we don't start with the listening.
And I think there's another point to be made, and I found this to be true. Part of the work that I do in Uganda is we've been building a technical training school, because these kids going to college, what's the point unless they're going to be a professional at something, correct? Because where are they going to practice? I mean, there is right. That. So to give them a skill as they go forward in life, to sew, to this, that's a very meaningful, important contribution to who they can become as effective adult human beings. That being said, I want to ask you about this, or I want to state this on my point of view and hear what you have to say, and that is we have to be very careful how we impose our ways on other cultures, because we can actually risk something else here, which is demanding a rapid change to a society that just isn't ready for it yet. In itself can be something that's very dangerous. And I know, I watch these people, the NGOs, run in with all of their whatever, they got their ideas and they're told, and just, I'm not so sure we can do that all the time without causing more problems than are there in the first place. What are your thoughts?
I agree with you 110%. I absolutely agree with you. And you see it time and time again, and everyone's well-meaning.
Yes.
I mean, I don't mean to say that, you don't want to slap anybody for wanting to help. But at the same time, you hear these stories of everything from church groups and school groups going and building schools, and they don't know how to build. And so the poor local people have to go and take everything down and relay the bricks, and it becomes more of a hassle. And that's the innocent, laughable story. It can be far more devastating. It can be done on a corporate level. It can be done by NGOs. And I mean, I just couldn't agree with you more there. It can't be scorched earth. You're going to have to spend some time listening, learning, and adapting your beliefs and your well-meaningness, I guess, with what is really actually on the ground and what people have to live with and what you'll leave in your wake. I mean, those are all really important factors. And, coming now living in the Bay Area, and there's so many, people establishing foundations, all these .com people that want to fix everything that's broken. And, there's an app for that or whatever. And they're working on scarce information,
Yeah. And it's very dangerous. And I've seen it with even groups that I've traveled with when I go over there, and sometimes my eyes roll because you cannot be that righteous.
That's right.
You just cannot be that righteous, because you know what? We can empathize, but we can't walk in their shoes or their lack of thereof.
You're right.
Okay.
You're absolutely right.
I've been speaking with Joni Bender, the author of Mile 46, Face to Face in Maasailand. For more information on Joanie and her work, visit jonibender.com. And to listen to our entire conversation when we are joined by Futures Without Violence founder Esther Soler, visit HalliCasser-Jayne.com. You'll find the interview posted on our large player. Thanks so much for tuning in to the Halli Casser-Jayne Show, a production of Resec LLC. The Halli Casser-Jayne Show posts new podcasts Wednesdays, 3 p.m. Eastern. Visit HalliCasser-Jayne.com.